At the very start of the first episode of the 1973 documentary series The World at War, Laurence Olivier utters the chilling words, "Down this road on a summer day in 1944 the soldiers came. Nobody lives there now." The place he's describing, eerily illustrated in film, is Oradour Sur Glane, a large village very near the city of Limoges in Haute-Vienne, central France. It's a place name that is very well known in France. Nobody lives there now because on one day in June 1944 it was destroyed, its inhabitants murdered. It became known as the Martyred Village, a symbol of France's suffering under the occupation by Nazi Germany between June 1940 and September 1944. On June the 6th, 1944, 4 days before the massacre, the Allies had begun landing on the beaches of Normandy. Word of what was happening on the northern coast was spreading through radio broadcasts. It was also reaching Oradour via family and friends in the nearby major city of Limoges. Celebrations were muted. Oradour was a quiet, peaceful place. Though people had lost faith in the collaborationist government and wanted the occupier gone, the occupation had not hit the village in the way it had big towns and cities, or even other areas of France. German soldiers had never even been seen in the village at all. Let's take a step back. By June 1944, France had been occupied for 4 years. Having quickly fallen to Germany in June 1940, it was divided into zones. The main two zones were separated by a demarcation line which split the country in two, almost diagonally. The northern zone, which included all of the western coast, was fully occupied from the moment Marshal Pétain's new government signed an armistice, which brought an end to France's humiliating defeat. The southern zone, in which Oradour Sur Glane fell, was to be unoccupied. Instead, it would be run by a new French government based in Vichy. Crucially, it would police itself. However, in November 1942, when the Allies landed in northern Africa, Hitler reneged on the deal and the southern zone was occupied. France was, over time, drained of its resources and its manpower. People became hungry, particularly in towns and cities. Vichy politicians allowed and even encouraged the roundup of undesirables, such as Jews and gypsies. France was no longer a partner to Germany, rather a store cupboard. Meanwhile, resistance had developed, first in towns and cities and then in the countryside. When the D-Day landings happened, it became increasingly clear that Germany was going to lose the war. The armed resistance, directed from London, stepped up their operations. The Limousin region became increasingly hazardous for the Germans. Some called it Little Russia. An SS Panzer Division Das Reich was instructed to make its way slowly to Normandy, but to also solve the problem of the partisans on the way. An order was given to carry out a lasting and brutal strike that would persuade ordinary people not to provide any help to the resistance. 4 days after D-Day, just after lunch on 10th of June, an operation began in the chosen village of Oradour Sur Glane. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, following a showery and overcast morning. A battalion of approximately 150 to 200 soldiers from the now infamous SS Panzer Division Das Reich were dispatched from nearby Saint-Julien. A cordon was set up and everyone within the village and from the hamlets and squares around were ordered to gather in the village square and to wait. Eventually the men were separated from the women and children who were taken to the church. The village was systematically destroyed. 643 men, women and children were slaughtered. For several days afterwards, smaller SS groups returned to create mass burial sites. Their reasoning? None of the bodies left scattered around could ever be formally identified. A couple of days later, villagers were finally allowed back into the still smouldering village. But the buildings, including the village's ancient Église Saint-Martin, were little more than roofless shells. Piles of human remains that had turned to ash and brittle bone were found within the church, and inside the confessional box of the church the bodies of 2 young children were found clutching each other in terror. The church bell had melted and fallen. Remnants of prams lay strewn. It was within the church that just about all of the 246 women and 207 children had died. In 6 further locations around the village, storerooms, garages, and barns, unrecognisable human debris was all that remained of the men, including boys over the age of 16, who had been calmly gathered there, then shot and burned. In only one location could any of the bodies be identified, and this was mainly due to personal items discovered once the flames had died down. By the time the cordon was lifted, most of the unburned remains had been taken to the shallow mass graves, but remains were also found in a well, in a baker's oven, and in other unimaginable places. Only 52 out of 643 burnt corpses could be identified and buried in individual graves. News spread slowly, as did rumours as to why the massacre had taken place. It was because of resistance activity within the village, said most of the rumours. People were terrified. The day before the Oradour massacre, 99 suspected maquisards were hanged from the lampposts and balconies in the nearby town of Tulle. Other villages had been burnt out, and elsewhere people had been executed for their apparent links to the resistance. But Oradour was something else. A whole village had been made to pay. Within months, with France liberated, General de Gaulle declared that the site would be preserved just as it was. A new village where life would continue would be built right alongside the martyred village. Since then, over almost 80 years, hundreds of thousands of people have visited the remains. I first visited when I was a teenager, before the Centre de la Mémoire, which opened in 1999, was actually built. We went through a small gate beside which books and postcards were sold from a cabin at the very end of the road that you can see now. Signs told us to remember and to compose ourselves. I took pictures on black and white film. The visit stayed with me and has done ever since. Despite the site having significantly changed over the years, ever since I first saw it 30 years ago, it still has the power to make a really profound impression on anyone of any age and any nationality. This evening, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the importance of Oradour Sur Glane in the history of France and its occupation. I'd then like to tell you a little bit about my own approach to writing a book about it. I'll discuss the very important question of why it happened and why this particular place was chosen. Finally, I'll share what the progress taught me as a historian. A quick internet search will quickly show that the Oradour story has resurfaced over the decades and continues to do so. In 2020, the number of victims was increased by 1 to 643 when, due to the efforts of a Spanish historian, a Spanish grandmother called Ramona Dominguez Gil was pronounced by the Limoges High Court to have died in the massacre, becoming victim number 643. In 2013, a plaque was placed in a hamlet called La Fauvette, a short stroll from the centre of the preserved village. It commemorates the site of one of France's many work camps where Spanish refugees were interned and exploited for labour between 1940 and 1942. The Spanish link helped to open up more research about how Oradour had changed and what it had become by June 1944. By then it was home to refugees, persecuted Jews and escaped prisoners of war, as well as young men hiding from obligatory work service to Germany. Children had been sent to the village for safety, away from cities that might face bombing. Oradour has featured in national and international press for various reasons in recent years. In May of this year, Ukrainian President Zelensky name-checked Oradour when addressing French politicians, asking for it to be borne in mind and equating it with the many similar massacres that were and are, quite unbelievably, still taking place in Ukraine. For Oradour, read Bucha. Why? Well, Oradour is such a strong reference in the minds of the French people. It helps people register the horror of such events in ways that the TV news can't. This is one of the reasons most French schoolchildren are taken to the site. However, it didn't take long for online trolls to use the name of Oradour, in trying to denigrate Zelensky and certain sections of Ukraine's own forces. It seems that the mention of Oradour automatically leads to mention of the SS Das Reich, and this is something that is highly regrettable. In September 2013, then German President Joachim Gauck and French President François Hollande accompanied survivor Robert Ebra into the church, a significant moment. This was the culmination of efforts over a long term of conciliation, and it was highly symbolic, a cause for which Ebra has worked particularly hard. In 2011, investigators found a file in the archives of the Stasi, the East German police, which established the probable identities of almost all of the soldiers of the 3rd Company, 1st Battalion, 4th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment Der Führer, a subordinate unit of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, those who took part in the operation in Oradour that day. Most were German, others were forced conscripts from Alsace-Lorraine, and a few others were from elsewhere in occupied Europe. Early in 2013, the investigators went to Oradour, and in March 2014, an 89-year-old man was investigated by German anti-war crime investigators as a result of the investigations, but no charge was brought against that man, Werner Christkat, despite his admittance that he was there. Christkat had not been among those who had been brought to trial in 1952, when a military tribunal in Bordeaux had tried a handful of German prisoners as well as 14 Alsatians who had been forcibly recruited to the Das Reich. These young men, known as malgré nous, were found guilty. But the very idea of Frenchmen carrying out the massacre had added a different dimension to that Bordeaux trial. These malgré nous were then almost immediately pardoned by the French National Assembly. Relations between the survivors of Oradour, the people of Alsace-Lorraine, and the French government was strained to breaking point as a result. Furthermore, the people of Oradour had to face the fact that the most vicious of the village's slayers had escaped. The names of the generals responsible for ordering the crime were known almost immediately afterwards. These men were protected from extradition and trial by conciliatory accords between France, Britain, and West Germany. Post-war politics meant that few who had been responsible or who had taken part in the operation were ever punished. In February 2015, the French magazine Paris Match located Georges René Bouze, the only one of the Alsatian contingent in Bordeaux who had been voluntarily recruited. Bouze was one of the more notorious known officers and admitted killing in cold blood. He had his death sentence commuted to imprisonment. Before being found by the journalists, he had been believed dead. After the Bordeaux trial, he had served his sentence, released after 14 years. He finally died in 2016. The same journalists located another Alsatian, Albert Dole, the following year and interviewed him. Interesting though these stories were, they offered nothing particularly new. The main point of interest being that they stuck to their stories, the official stories, as propagated by those in ranks far higher than them. The official version of events, as constructed by members of the Das Reich, have never gone away. The destruction of Oradour was quickly condemned by the German High Command, even before Pétain wrote to them to protest. But those involved in ordering the massacre quickly found a scapegoat as well as a framework on which to build a defence to which they stuck. They stuck to it like a brotherhood over the decades that followed. That framework follows the lines of that of Major Otto Weidiger in his regimental history of Das Reich, which was that of resistance activity in the village. Ever since, and increasingly since the advent of social media, it would appear, revisionists continue to make these same claims, as ridiculous as they are. Shockingly, graffiti was sprayed on the walls of the visitor centre in the spring of 2020, referring to the name of a far-right revisionist whose conspiracy theories regarding Oradour have been often disproved. The vandalism made newspapers and television news bulletins around Europe even the world, and was universally condemned. Such people haven't gone away, however, and it's for this reason that historical research is so important. The research that I did, among so much that's gone before, helps, I hope, to show that Oradour, for all its faults, was a perfectly normal place. So, the story of Oradour has always had a strained relationship with the memory of the French resistance. Indeed, the relationship between the people of the village and their families and the resistance has always been very complicated and actually quite sensitive. It draws accusations of the village bringing its fate on itself. For many, de Gaulle represented resistance, and for many years France was the nation of resistance. Is there any evidence of resistance in Oradour? Well, yes. And earlier this year, I found documentary evidence of a cell linked to the Armée Secrète. It composes a handful of individuals who probably distributed some literature or perhaps met to discuss politics. So yes, there were men active in resistance movements. But, and this is important, there are no surprises. We knew about these people anyway. They were certainly not active combatants, what we call maquisards. Maquis groups didn't camp in or near villages. The nearest camp to Oradour was miles away, 10 miles away. As I'll come back to later, Oradour was a microcosm of Vichy France. Any type of resistance was, like collaboration, the occupation of an extremely small number of people. Let me say now that the massacre was not, as been claimed by those revisionists I mentioned earlier, any direct result of resistance activities in the village or in the immediate area. It was, however, inextricably linked to the story of resistance. The Das Reich was not on its route north as quickly as it could possibly go. It had been told to engage in action against the resistance. But fighting against guerrillas was impossible, so it targeted the population. This was a known strategy used throughout the Limousin region, where the Maquis were providing annoyingly effective resistance. My interest turned to researching a book which aimed to paint a realistic picture of what the village was like at that moment in time, and of the people who were there on 10th of June 1944. I've come to understand that context is everything. Like I said, there was never any armed resistance in Oradour. A village, well, you might say a bourg, a larger village. It was an agricultural hub that contained all sorts of people. It was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's something I'll come back to. So I'd like to talk now a little bit about my approach to the story of Oradour, having made the decision to concentrate first and foremost on the village and the families that lived there. Why did I want to do this? Well, I decided that the massacre is generally mentioned in history books in the context of the SS Das Reich. I'm not a military historian, and in a way, I wanted to remove the SS from the limelight. As I learned more, I became consumed by what that village had been before the tragedy. I was also surprised at how the makeup and population of the village had changed since the declaration of war in September 1939 to its final day when it had all just stopped still. In my mind, Oradour was a bit like a modern day Pompeii. I wanted to explore the clues and create a kind of social history, a micro-history of a village, a bit like an ethnography, just up to the point of its demise. Unlike most places in France, or I should say in Vichy France, the war had not had the chance to play out, and people hadn't had the opportunity to change sides at that point. I felt that by recreating a sense of what the village was, and who its people were, warts and all, the reader might understand the impact of the event. What's more, the tracing of the everyday existence of the Radonneaux, that's the people of the village, returns to these hard-working villagers and individuality, and it restores the community's own identity. This approach revealed a good deal about what life was like in Vichy France at that crucial moment. It also revealed surprising detail that Gaullist collective martyrdom had for so long subdued. This was the approach I took too when interviewing 4 survivors. I knew their accounts of that one day, having read their witness statements and publications since, but what I was most interested in was their lives and what things had been like at the time, and I think that this approach proved fruitful. So I tried to create a snapshot of the morning of 10th of June 1944. Who was there and why? The children were in school that day. People had come to shop to collect their décade of tobacco, their week's worth of tobacco, or they were passing on their bicycles, some to source food from local farmers all around the village. I hope and believe that my picture of the community of Oradour at that moment is accurate, even if it is just something of a sketch. The village of Oradour Sur Glane was large. It was an ordinary village that found its place in an increasingly complex society. Set in the rolling Limousin countryside beside a meandering river, the Glane, it was for centuries known as a quiet spot, ideal for weekend visits to fish or swim. It was a bourg, so it was central to a commune, a small district that took in hamlets and farms all around. The installation of its direct tram link to nearby Limoges meant that Oradour was more well off than other comparable places. It benefited from a local economy flexible enough to absorb the exertions of absent men. Some businesses doubled up. This was quite normal at this time. So a cafe, the one in the picture there, was also a barber shop and a hat shop too. One cement trader also doubled as a cafe and a music room. Prior to the outbreak of war in September 1939, when the village was known for its shops, its cafes, its restaurants, its riverbank, people came from Limoges on the weekend. The hotels were filled, and the Hôtel Milor was renowned for its spécialité tête de veau. There were music groups and a drama society. The social scene revolved around the many watering holes and the bal, or balls, held in the rooms above the hotels. It saw many changes. Almost as soon as war was declared in September 1939, its men mobilised. Evacuees arrived almost immediately from Strasbourg. Then the French war effort crumbled, and waves of refugees arrived from northern France, Paris and the Low Countries. Marshal Philippe Pétain put a stop to dancing while France mourned its swift defeat to Germany. Hotels and many private homes were filled with newcomers, restaurants all but shut. Some of the menfolk returned, others were detained in prisoner of war camps. More refugees arrived when Alsace-Lorraine became a dependency of the Reich and French speakers were ejected. These new arrivals to the region included significant numbers of Jews from established Jewish communities in Strasbourg and Metz. With the whole area Germanized, they were prohibited from ever returning there, resulting in the Limousin gaining a new Jewish community. Oradour became a place increasingly used to outsiders, and for a short time between 1941 and 1942, the 643rd GTE, or Groupement de Travailleurs Étrangers, was located there. or just outside the village. Devised to house and economically exploit Spanish refugees who had fled Franco's new regime in the late 1930s, work details were back-breaking and the pay meagre. The GTE provided the only way for Spanish refugees to legally remain in France, even if it meant former lawyers and doctors having to cut peat, break stones, or saw wood. The families followed, setting up homes nearby, and even though the Oradour camp was moved away from the village itself, a small Spanish community had been established there. The picture you can see is in the Champ de Foire in Oradour. The men of the GTE are raising the flag, and it's on that spot pretty much that the population were gathered on the 10th of June 1944, and that's where you'll see the car, the famous car, if you go there now. In November 1942, the crossing of the demarcation line, as I mentioned earlier, with full occupation of France, brought big changes. Hitler drained the country for the Reich. Restrictions bit home, and young men were sent to Germany to work, or else they hid. People still came to Oradour, despite the reduction in the tram service. This video is film recently discovered of Oradour in 1943. As the occupation went on, the shelves in towns and cities emptied of basic produce that was freely available in the countryside. The farms in and around villages like Oradour had plenty of milk, bread, eggs, and vegetables to sell. So no Germans and very few police were seen in Oradour throughout the occupation. The period of occupation didn't mean soldiers or even miliciens on the streets in villages such as Oradour. It meant lots of new faces and new ways of getting by. By June 1944, Oradour Sur Glane had become a microcosm of Vichy France. Support for Pétain had waned, and trust in the Vichy government had been destroyed by years of restrictions, economy draining, and calls on manpower. Most were simply united in their hatred of occupation. So why Oradour Sur Glane? The Nazi leaders wanted a whole village erased for all time as a reminder of their power and as a warning to stop ordinary people supporting resistance activity. They wanted no survivors, no recognisable bodies. There's evidence to suggest that nearby Saint-Junien was the intended target after some skirmishes with the Maquis a couple of days earlier, in which a German soldier was killed. If that was the case, the decision makers certainly changed their mind when they saw the size of that town. There's no truth to the popular theory that the wrong Oradour was chosen. There are several places carrying the place name Oradour in the local area, but some have claimed that Oradour Sur Ver was the intended target. There was Maquis activity there, but that was 35 kilometres in the wrong direction. But these were professional soldiers who could use maps. Oradour Sur Glane was at a good distance in the right direction. I have seen mention of that theory of the wrong Oradour in witness statements taken as early as November 1944. Whether local rumour or clever use of misinformation by the Germans, it's not at all plausible. The disappearance of Major Helmut Kampf has, over the decades, also been given as a prime reason for the destruction of Oradour. And this rumour, first propagated by the German High Command soon after the massacre, was instigated in an attempt to shift blame onto the resistance. While timing links the events, the arrest of Kampf presented an opportunity for the German High Command, who had already decided that a whole village or small town would be wiped off the face of the earth. It created an opportunity to create a scapegoat. SS Sturmbannführer Adolf Dickmann was a personal friend of Kampf and was sent to be in charge. He was a very unstable man, and those higher up the chain of command, such as General Lammerding, overall commander of the Das Reich based in Limoges, knew that it had upset that Digman would carry out the task. He was a man who had already proved himself capable of such work. He lacked scruples, was reliant on alcohol, and followed orders without question. That he was killed in Normandy weeks later proved perfect for their story. Kampf was abducted and a search initiated, but that was to the north and to the east of Limoges. It was not near Oradour Sur Glane. During one of the searches on the morning of 10th of June 1944 for Kampf, SOE operative Violet Szabo was picked up and arrested. Kampf was finally executed on 11th of June 1944 when a local Maquis leader, Georges Gangouin, who had been holding him, heard about Oradour. Up to that point, an exchange had been in motion, but Kampf's killing was actually a result of, and not the reason for, the massacre of Oradour. If Oradour had not been destroyed, it would have been any other village on the route that the division was following, provided it met the same criteria. Oradour was easy to surround. It presented no immediate difficulty with entrenched maquisards nearby, and local miliciens could provide ample information about the place. The real perpetrators of the crime, because this was a war crime, those who gave the orders, escaped justice. Only one further trial took place after the 1953 Bordeaux trial. One further trial took place in East Berlin in 1983. It was that of SS Untersturmführer Heinz Barth. He was the most senior former SS officer ever brought to account, though Barth had not been charged on the ground. He had not been in charge on the ground. He was finally arrested in December 1981, but when extradition had become no option because of the new atmosphere of European détente, he was actually released in August 1997 due to supposed ill health, but managed to survive for a decade after being released. The SS Panzer Division came to Oradour Sur Glane with the intention of deleting a whole village from the map of France. In his trial, Barth was asked whether he had thanked God that there had been some survivors. No, he said. Honestly, I didn't think that, at least not at the time. I have to be completely honest. I was quite shocked to find out that there had been some escapees from that village because we left on the principle that, as far as we knew, there were no survivors. In the days and weeks that followed the massacre, as stories of known survivors emerged, most of them had to be moved to secret locations. They were being sought by the milice, who had seemingly been instructed to remove the last known witnesses. Whoever made the decision to eradicate the village, or whichever village would ultimately be chosen, wanted to make a statement. That was that German power was still such that it could remove a whole village from the face of the earth, and it was willing to do so. There would be no half measure. No buildings would be left standing, no person remaining. For this, the reason was twofold. It would be symbolic, first. A community erased entirely from existence represented the power of the German military machine. Second, there should be no witnesses to the crime. The action would clearly constitute a war crime. Such brutal measures were commonplace in the East, where the Das Reich had spent the previous 2 years. But this level of mass murder would shock the French, it would shock the British, it would shock the Americans. For that reason, a smokescreen of untruth was created. Even the soldiers with whom people communicated during the day seemed to have a variety of reasons for being there. No witnesses from the village would mean that the truth could never get out, that the resistance could be blamed, and the population would desist from helping the resistance. But there were survivors. Miraculously, one woman emerged from the church. Marguerite Roufanche had just seen her 2 daughters, her baby grandchild, and countless other members of her large family killed. A mix of asphyxiation, bullets fired into the church, and fire had killed almost everybody in the locked building, but she managed to climb from a window, dropping onto a banking below. One other woman, a young mother, called Henriette Ivanhoe, tried to follow, but neither she nor her own baby son escaped the bullets. Marguerite was shot too, but she crawled to safety, having been assumed dead. She was found days later among the peas in the vestry garden, asking to be killed to stop the pain. But she survived, as did her testimony. One child also survived. Young Roger Godfrin was from a family that had been evacuated to the region, to the village of Oradour Sur Glane, from Moselle, when the area was reclaimed by the Nazis and Francophone elements expelled, not permitted to return. The Godfrin children had been warned by their parents to run if ever they saw Germans. Unlike the people of Oradour, who'd hardly ever seen a German soldier before that day, the people of Alsace-Lorraine and Moselle were well aware of what they might represent. So when the troops arrived and the school children were rounded up, Roger did run. He tried to persuade his sisters to accompany him as he was sneaking out of the school, but they were taken in by the soldiers' claim that they were being rounded up for an identity check. Roger survived bullets. He saw horrific things. Another witness, as were several others who hid in and around the village. These testimonies provide further details of what actually happened in the village that day. A handful of men got away from the Lordier-Mounier barn, one of 6 places of execution where the men were shot, then set alight. The accounts provided by these men were remarkable. One of the men survives to this day. Robert Hébras is perhaps the face most associated with Oradour, certainly in France. He now no longer takes school children around the site, but he's only recently stopped doing so. I was lucky enough a few years ago to meet him and interview him for my book. Others successfully hid or fled as the SS approached. There may not have been that many, but their testimonies have proved invaluable to my own recent research. One cobbler, for example, called Marcel Machefer, he was already under surveillance by the Vichy authorities due to his past links to communist militancy, and he fled fearing arrest. He lost his wife and 2 children, who stayed behind and went to the roundup. The young family had been provided shelter to a 15-year-old Jewish girl called Sarah Yakubovich. She didn't go to the roundup. Her charred body was found underneath a bed in the home of Marcel Machefer. 2 brothers, one an escaped prisoner of war, the other an evader from obligatory work service in the Reich, which we sometimes refer to as STO. Well, they successfully hid in their usual hiding place until fire forced them out. In fact, several STO evaders or evadees survived by hiding, as did a handful of further Jews. One Jewish couple, named Lang, were from the Bordeaux suburbs. They were hidden in a cellar by a neighbour. A Jewish dentist from Brittany, who had been staying in one of the village's hotels, had crossed the demarcation line with his wife before splitting from her for reasons of safety. He watched events unfold from a ditch and only discovered after the war that his wife had not survived the death camps. There was the remarkable Jewish Pinhead family, who had come to Oradour in 1943, having been expelled from Bayonne, which fell within the occupied zone. Not that made much difference at that point. The 3 older children survived, having been told to hide by their father, Robert. He, his wife, and his mother didn't survive, just like so many others. What made the following decades so devastating was that the schools were full that day. Many children from the surrounding hamlets, and some of these children who had come to school that day had come from hamlets that were further away from the village than the cordon for the roundup actually reached. Each day, children would gather in groups and walk to the schools in Oradour. Hundreds of parents waved goodbye to their children that morning and had to wait days afterwards to discover what had happened to them. The result was devastating. One of my interviewees was called Albert Valade, and he lost his older sister when she went to the village to try and find her own children. During the interview, there was one moment when he could barely look up from his desk. One thing that's not so well known, he said, is the suffering and how long that lasted for the people of the villages. The hamlets, you see, were not destroyed. They were intact. But there were no more children, and that is no exaggeration. There were no more children. This picture shows a gathering of children in Oradour Sur Glane, probably about a year before the massacre. So it's for all of these reasons that I wanted to move the focus of the Oradour story away from the perpetrators. I wanted to rediscover some of the voices lost in time. As I read witness statement after witness statement taken immediately after the massacre, I was led to new places. A lot of change took place over the course of 5 years, from September 1939 to June 1944, as I've already said. Refugees, evacuees, displaced families all arrived in this large village. New faces appeared, children and women primarily from places as diverse as Paris, Roubaix in the north, Barcelona, Avignon in the south. Most hoping to escape the bombs expected to fall on those places, and also to fall on nearby Limoges, and particularly Paris. I found out some contradictory things, and things that perhaps might not fit well with the history of the occupation. There were Pétainists looking after Jewish families, for example, as well as STO evaders, escaped prisoners of war. This put them at odds with the Vichy politics. So doing all this, I got to understand why there were, for example, so many names from Alsace-Lorraine, different in 1944 to those that were listed as having arrived during the evacuation in 1939, because some had gone back, others had arrived, some had to stay because they were Jewish, for example. What else did I get to know? Well, I got to know who owned the farm buildings and how farmers thrived in the countryside while shelves were being emptied in nearby cities. I got to know whether there were any milicians, and when the right-wing Legion petered out. The story of the Spanish and the GTE camp, which I've mentioned already, in the village was revelatory. As a result of all the movement, people fell in love, others set up businesses. The church congregation waned, then flourished. Schools filled up. I tried to knit it all together into a narrative. Oradour was, I realised, its own story, regardless of the massacre. We know about its tragic ending, But historians need to do more of the digging for the mundane. We need to concentrate less on the heroes and particularly on the villains. Where there are epics like Germany's ultimate defeat and grand complex villains like the Vichy government, there are many more intricate and interesting patchworks of ordinary life. You can see here the tracks of the tram that led from Limoges up into the centre of Oradour on the right hand side. They are still there. Rather than think of Oradour as a place of tragedy, I prefer to think of it as the set of a kind of a soap opera, a historical drama from which we can learn so much. Thank you.